I'm Mike Myatt. I'm the president and CEO of the Marines Memorial. And I'll tell you about the Marines Memorial. It's an organization that was founded in 1946 to honor the legacy of military service. We do that through programs like this. We're here tonight to hear Dr. Jim Wright speak on his book, Enduring Vietnam, An American Generation and Its War. I tell you, I've read the book. I'm fascinated by it. And I've known him for a while because he's on the board with me at the Injured Marine Semper Fi Fund. And I'm going to tell you, he's quite a gentleman. He's quite a storyteller. And I would like you to all welcome tonight Dr. Jim Wright.
Thank you for inviting me here. I did have the privilege of serving with General Myatt on the board of the Semper Fi Fund. And I would say that Mike Myatt is a man who served bravely and well. He led Marines, and he has devoted his life to looking after those who served. And I want to thank you for that, Mike. For you, Semper Fidelis is more than a slogan. It's a statement of your life and your commitment. So thank you for all that you've done, Mike. Now this is a special city for me. Susan and I my wife Susan here, we've enjoyed many visits here. I first came here in April of 1958, 59 years ago, when I was assigned to the Marine staging area over at Treasure Island. We shipped out from Oakland on the old World War II Jeep carrier, the Cape Esperance, and we went to Pearl Harbor for my deployment at Kaneohe Bay. I joined the Marines a year earlier with 4 friends from my high school graduating class, and one of them, Dave Eisbach, who now lives in San Jose, and he served in the 1st Marine Division down at Pendleton. He was a corporal, outranking me. I was lucky to be a lance corporal by the time I was discharged. But I was discharged here at Treasure Island in 1960. I want to talk tonight, though, about my book. And perhaps the best way to do that is to try to describe why I wrote it, what I aimed to do in this book, and why I aimed to do it. Last year, Susan and I attended a performance of Hamilton in New York. Now, many lines in that play are memorable, but one of them kept running through my head after we were at the play. Eliza Hamilton, the widow of Alexander Hamilton, sang with a chorus of founding fathers, "Who lives, who dies, and who tells the story?" This is relevant to my remarks because in any war, in any armed confrontation, I guess the first questions are the determinative ones: who lives and who dies? Stripped of all other explanations, at its core, this is the fundamental human question. Indeed, this is the cruel purpose of war. Who lives and who dies? It's best never to forget this. That's why I have such a great difficulty with the boots on the ground metaphor that people often use to talk about sending American troops into some distant, dangerous place. I keep reminding them that we're not talking about shoe leather that goes to these places. We're talking about our young who serve. And we're asking them to confront the question, who lives and who dies? But then after the shooting stops, and most of us can step back and say, we had no part in that, we had no role in it. We did, of course. But after the shooting stops, the lingering question keeps remaining there. Who tells your story? And the shared narrative of battles and wars fought is the framing of the story. It provides an assessment of the value of a life that is lost. It reminds us of who this person was. And it marks forever the survivors who knew them and who carry the memories with them. I interviewed a lot of people for this book, and I remember an interview I had with a Marine who had been an officer at Quezon in late 67 and 68, and he finished his tour and came back home he was stationed in Rhode Island at the naval facility there. And one of his assignments there was to go out and inform parents that their son was not coming home, and most of them were parents rather than spouses because Marines were younger in Vietnam. And he told the story of going to this one house and knocking on the door, and a man, the father, greeted him warmly at the door and saw he was a Marine, and he started to explain to him why he was there, and the father started weeping and went into a rage and tried to hit him and started wrestling with him, and they wrestled around on the floor. And he said, this father was above me trying to hit me. He said, I knew I could very comfortably take care of this man in a fight, but the last thing I wanted to do was to fight this father who had just lost his Marine in Vietnam. Finally, his wife and the priest that the Marine had brought with him over to the house managed to get the father off, and they sat there talking for a while. And then the mother asked, when will our son's body come home? And the Marine who was out on duty there informed them about 10 days probably. And the priest totally innocently said, oh, right before Christmas. And the father went into a rage again and started wrestling with the Marine officer. I talked to somebody from Pennsylvania who was 14 years old, I guess, when his brother was killed in Vietnam. He was home alone, and there was a knock on the door, and there were two soldiers there, and they didn't say anything to him, but they asked to speak to his parents, and he said, well, they weren't home, but they had just called, and they're coming home shortly, and they said, we'll wait then, and they waited on the porch. And he went out to talk to them, and he saw they were in the Army, and he said, I have a brother who's in the Army. My brother flies a helicopter. He's in Vietnam. This is my brother's name. Do you know him? Do you know my brother? And then the parents came home, and the soldier said that his brother would not be returning home. And he said he ran up in a hill behind their house and just sat and wept and wept and wept, embarrassed, feeling the loss of an older brother whom he respected very much, but realizing how embarrassing it was when he kept asking, do you know my brother? We all need to assist in the responsibility of carrying of and sharing these stories. These need to become embedded in the national narrative, not the stories of the knock on the door, but the stories of the brothers who did not come home. And it's critical, though, to note that the stories are about more than those who die. Those who serve with them also have important reflections to share, and they need to do this rather than to remain burdened with the silent memories that so many of the Vietnam generation have carried. The narratives of serving in the military and combat have been subdued really since World War II. Many people do point to the Vietnam War as a factor in a declining interest in veterans and in their experiences. Now, there's no doubt that Vietnam veterans were seldom celebrated, and that clearly related to the fact that at least by the late 1960s, their war had become very unpopular. But it doesn't follow that the unpopularity of their war made those who served unpopular. The outright hostility toward the men, while unfortunately present, many people encountered it, it was not as widespread as some of the folklore would have. But what was widespread was an indifference, the discomfort that the veterans experienced. These were not exaggerated. Remember the story of a Marine who came home, and his father was a Marine, had been at Iwo Jima. And he said, you know, my dad never once asked me to tell him about Vietnam. He said, I thought at least I'd come home and talk to my father about it, but nobody was interested in knowing what we did. So these stories remained largely untold. How many Vietnam veterans are here this evening? Goodness, thank you so much. In my book, I quote from a poem that was shared with me by a sailor who had been serving on a patrol boat, a swift boat, down in the Mekong Delta. In April of 1969, he had watched a very close friend of his die when their boat was ambushed by enemy troops on a narrow waterway of the Delta. A month later, this sailor had a few days off and went to Saigon for R&R. And he described sitting in his hotel room in Saigon, looking out the window and watching a storm come into the city. He wrote in a diary that he shared with me, "The sky is black now, illuminated now and then by silent strobes of lightning, people hustling about before the storm and before the curfew. But soon the rains will come and cool us all and slow the motion, and the city will become quiet under the soothing rhythm of the rain. People will move inside and watch the monsoon downpour from a darkened window." And he concluded, some perhaps will reflect on the day just ended. And some will reflect on the day just ended. I can assure you, and those of you veterans here now can assure, that those who were there have seldom stopped reflecting. But it's long past time for the rest of us to understand the experience. Telling the story, hearing it, and reflecting on it, this is a burden that we all share with those who were there. And so tonight I would like to just reflect with you my effort to think about the days of that war that the sailor said in the days now ended. For many years and many days, to reflect on the human experience of the Americans who served in Vietnam. In 1965, in March of 1965, you went over at that time, General Myatt, when the American ground war began, when the Marines came in at Da Nang, the dominant public image of those serving in Vietnam was of young heroes fighting communists someplace in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Within a few years, as the casualties increased significantly and the draft picked up, many came to consider them objects of sympathy. Poor kids asked to fight a cruel and an ill-advised war. And after the story of My Lai became public in late 1969, in the minds of many, those who were over there became instead the perpetrators of that cruel war. Drug-addled psychotics, the Apocalypse Now image. I have described the movie Apocalypse Now as Vietnam meets Woodstock. I made that comment at a gathering down in Burbank the other night, and a few people associated with the film industry had been working on that film insisted it was an accurate film. It may be a good movie, it is a good movie, but it is not a study of the Vietnam experience. In few of the popular accounts on the Vietnam War except for the powerful ones written by veterans, Webb, Marlantes, O'Brien, and others. In few accounts were those who served recognized for what they were, scared kids who signed up for a difficult and a very scary assignment. We know them, we know that generation as the baby boomers, as the 60s generation, as the Woodstock celebrants and the anti-war protesters, the stereotyped hippies who challenged the boundaries of American culture. And many were that. But it was clear to me that these images do not provide a full face of this generation, of the baby boomer generation. Not at all a full story of that generation. For example, nearly 40% of the 60s generation of the baby boomers served in the military. About 10% of them were in Vietnam. More baby boomers died in Vietnam and have their names recorded on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall than went to Canada or went to prison for evading the draft. So my book tries to tell a story of, reminds us of some of the members of this generation. It's enriched by over 160 interviews that I completed with men and women who served in combat or in medical units in Vietnam. Now, my focus was primarily on the ground troops. I talked to Army infantry and Marines, people who fought. I talked to those who were out in the jungle, up in the highlands, out in the Delta, because I was trying to describe in some greater detail who died, who was there, and I wanted to talk to those who were with them. And I also focus in on the spring of 1969, which I do think was a pivot point in the nature of the war. I talked to each of the people I interviewed about why they went, what they thought about going to Vietnam. I talked to them about the experience of serving there, about being with friends when they died, and about coming home, and about the years after they've come home. And I also interviewed members of families who confronted a military delegate at the front door and who told them that their son or daughter or spouse would not be coming home. A couple of weeks ago, I sent out personally inscribed copies to each of them, 160 books, and I told them that they were collaborators in my effort to tell this story. In the book, I try to explain what it was like to grow up in that post-World War II baby boomer generation, about the exciting America of those years, the experience of the expansion of possibility, about the emphasis on education and opportunity. It was an exciting time. But I also detail that scary world of the 1950s, of worries about impending nuclear attacks, about duck and cover drills in the schools, about the conviction, the shared fear that the world would be at war, and by the constant reminder that this nation would need to be prepared to fight this inevitable war, and its citizens would need to step up and assume the responsibility that accompanied citizenship. It was an era of the peacetime draft and the civic contract that reminded young men of their obligation to serve. Now, I am not in this book sympathetic to any of the political leaders who took us to Vietnam. My focus is not on them, but I can't say I'm kind to them either in writing about the steps they took. But my interest here is less in assessing the foreign policies and commitments of presidents from Truman to Nixon. Others have done this, and more will provide this history. My interest really is in trying to relate what it was like to grow up in a world that was described by political and cultural and educational and religious leaders as a place where Americans would need to stand up for freedom. The World War II veterans, the children of the Munich generation, the parents of the baby boomers, our parents. They warned what would happen if this country did not respond to threats and to challenges, that we had to be prepared to go to war. There's a wonderful account by Colin Powell, who first went over to Vietnam as a young Army officer in January of 1963. They were advisors then. Kennedy had put uniforms on the advisors. He had increased significantly the numbers of those that were there when Eisenhower was president. He was sent up to the Ashaw Valley to be an advisor with a ARVN, a South Vietnamese Army unit that was stationed up there in the Ashaw Valley. And he talked about a conversation he had shortly after he got there with a Captain Hugh, who was the commander of the post there, of the ARVN unit that was there. And he said to the captain, "Why is this outpost here?" The captain said, "This is a very important outpost. It is here to protect this airfield down below." And there was a grass airstrip down below where the outpost was. And Powell said, "Why is the airstrip there?" He said, "The airstrip is there to supply this outpost." Colin Powell, who would serve another deployment in Vietnam when the shooting was very intense, said he wasn't sure he ever heard a much better explanation of some of the circular logic, trying to explain to the troops on the ground, this is what our task is, this is what our assignment is. Now, in working on this book, in addition to my research and my reading and interviews and the intellectual framing of this story, I knew that I needed to visit Vietnam. I was in and out of the Marines before the Vietnam War began. But I didn't want to just go to the current tourist spas and the thriving cities. I had already completed most of my interviews, and I wanted to get out to the Delta, the high country, the jungles, the far reaches of I Corps, the places where the baby boomer generation fought, and where so many of the men whose stories I would tell had died. I was able to organize a trip through the group military historical tours in the late summer of 2014. Some of you may know Warren Weedon, a Marine veteran of the Chozon Reservoir and of Vietnam, who runs military historical tours. And he couldn't have been better in helping to arrange this, where I went over with a group of other veterans, then had a custom trip of my own up into the I Corps area. And I had as a trip leader the remarkable Captain Edgar, the late Captain Edgar. He served 2 tours in Vietnam and did about 100 trips over there running tour groups. And a year after I was with him, he suffered a major stroke in Vietnam, and he died shortly after he returned home. But I visited the Delta, and those of you who have been there know that simply a trip down some of those canals and feeder streams help you to understand why the young kids who patrolled along the waterways said this was a scary place. It was still kind of scary in 2014. I traveled up to Da Nang, and I went to the pilings that are the only remnants of the old Liberty Bridge. I visited the area that the Marines called Dodge City, southwest of Da Nang. And while I was there, I left behind a couple of mementos for Dartmouth Marines who had died there. One of them was a hockey player, and I buried a hockey puck in the rice paddy where he, as part of Kilo Company, had been ambushed crossing the rice paddy in the summer of 1967. And a few miles from there was one of his close Dartmouth friends who was with Mike Company when they were ambushed crossing a field. I looked across at Charlie Ridge. It's still dark and foreboding 45 years later. I went up to Way and walked around the ancient citadel that had been the site of so much intense fighting during TED in 1968. I went up by the old DMZ along Highway 9 from Quang Tri to Contien, then out to the Rock Pile and Razorback and Mutter's Ridge. Names that most Americans never knew, never heard, but names of places that were seared into the memory of those who served in these outposts. And I walked around the field at Quai Son. This field had been soaked with blood in 1968. And Lyndon Johnson and others worried about it becoming another Dien Bien Phu. It did not. I visited Kon Tum and Pleiku and spent some time at Dak To in the highlands. Stood on the old grass airstrip there where the Army 299th Combat Engineers had withstood vicious attacks in 1969. Up in the Oshawa Valley, I climbed Hamburger Hill. I climbed it in the late summer heat and humidity. I had met two North Vietnamese Army veterans in the nearby village of Alui who had fought against the Americans, and they accepted my invitation to accompany me climbing the hill. Greeted by a brief summer shower, the trail that we went up was steep and slippery. The Vietnamese government has put in some steps in some of the steepest places. One of the people I was with counted 930 steps, and believe me, the steps only were a very small part of that trail. But I stumbled and slid and I sweated, and I wondered how the young men of the 101st Airborne Division had climbed it in 1969. Knowing that they were over 50 years younger than I was not a sufficient explanation. No one was shooting down at me, and I wasn't carrying 50 or 60 pounds of equipment and ammunition. It took us 2 hours to reach the top. It took them 10 days. An important qualifier, it took 10 days for those soldiers who reached the top. Some of the units that had come in there by helicopter on May 10th, 1969 had 70 and 80% casualties over the next 10 days. And in many ways, in that brief moment on this isolated, hot, we didn't see anyone else on the day we walked up there. This hot, humid, triple canopied, quiet hilltop in Vietnam. I think so much of my own research, my personal biography, my commitment to supporting veterans and to remembering those who died, my scholarly focus, all of this seemed to come together. I have a chapter in my book on Hamburger Hill, Dong Ap Pia, the only battle that I treat in any real detail, because I do think it represents and symbolizes so much about the war. I want to tell the stories of the human faces and the human tragedies of war. Just sharing these stories is something that I think is important. I find it particularly troubling that the only name that most Americans would know of a Vietnam veteran was Lieutenant William Calley, who led that small AmeriCorps unit at My Lai. There were some truly impressive kids who served in Vietnam. They did some remarkable things. They did them on our behalf. Americans need to remember this. They were there on our behalf. You were there on our behalf. But few noticed and few thanked them. I'll pass along a few stories as Eliza Hamilton encouraged us to do, and as that sailor in Saigon reminded us to do. I talked to a Marine who went over as an officer, a platoon leader, and he shared with me his in-country orientation when they came into Da Nang. He was told as part of this orientation that the critical thing as an officer leading a combat platoon in Vietnam was not to cry and to make certain that his men never saw him cry. A few weeks later, one of the people in his unit that he was particularly fond of was killed in an ambush. And he still remembered 45 years later how hard he struggled not to cry when this young man was killed. This Marine died just 10 days ago, and I had received a note from him just a couple of days before that, encouraging me to tell the story, I have an account of a young Massachusetts man. He thought he might become a Jesuit priest, but he decided that was not his route, and he went to BU and graduated and got draft notice and went down to the Army recruiting station to check on his options, and they said, well, you can really sign up as an officer, or you can go in as an enlisted man. He said, why would I want to be an officer? I'd have to serve another 2 years, I think it was. And the recruiter said, well, I'll tell you why. You can either be an officer, sitting inside of an officer's club someplace, drinking a cold martini, or you can be an enlisted man outside the club walking guard duty for that officer inside. And he said, I decided I'd be an officer. That was my thing. He went in the first day at Hamburger Hill, and he was one of the few of the platoon leaders that were still there to go up to the top of the hill 10 days later. He remembered one of his last days before they reached the top. Blackjack Honeycutt told him, let's go at it again. And he went back to his men. This is maybe the 8th day, and he said, okay, we're going up. And they said, no, we're not going up. Come on. We have gone up and we keep losing men and we're not getting any place. To hell with it. Tell Blackjack to go up himself. And this young Army lieutenant said, I didn't know what to do. Nobody had trained me how to answer these sorts of things. And as another officer that had some men push back on him said, what are you going to do? Threaten to send them to Vietnam? When you're out there in the jungle, there's not much you can do. So this young officer went over and picked up his equipment and his rifle, and his men said, what are you doing, Lieutenant? And he said, I've got orders to go up the hill again, and I'm going up. And they said, oh, for God's sakes, we can't let you go up there alone. You need us around with you. Hold on a minute, we'll go. And just then, the North Vietnamese sent a few mortar rounds down to this place where they had spent the night. It didn't hit any of the men, but it landed over where some of their equipment was, on the edge of the clearing. And the guys ran over to check their equipment out, and one of them picked up his pack, and it was soaking wet. And he said, God damn it. He had been carrying a can of fruit cocktail for the last 10 days because the sweet juice of fruit cocktail was a real delicacy there, and he wanted to hold on to that and save it until he really needed it. And the shrapnel from the mortar rounds had punctured the can of fruit cocktail, and all the juice had drained out. And he said, God damn it, let's go. Well, I'm ready now to get them. And so off they went ahead, up the hill over the can of fruit cocktail. This man told me of a young soldier from Minnesota. They had been hit early on by some rockets and some mortars, and a couple of men were badly injured, and they had to put together a team to carry them down the hill because the helicopters couldn't get in. They had to get down lower so the helicopters could get in to pick up the wounded. And then the North Vietnamese hit again, and this one young sergeant was badly wounded, and a couple of guys carrying the stretcher were killed. And the lieutenant ran over and told this young man, don't worry, we'll get you down. He said, I don't think I want to make it. And he said, you'll make it, you'll make it. And so they got a stretcher and started carrying him down. And they said, the helicopter's going to carry you out of here. And he said, no, it won't. And he started singing, swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I talked to 3 men who were there that day, and they remember so profoundly that young soldier singing, swing low. He died before they got him to the bottom of the hill. I talked to one young man from the Bay Area here who got a note from his mother saying that she'd read in the San Francisco newspaper that the local Hells Angels group had decided it was time for them to go over there and get this war ended, and so they were trying to get themselves set to go over. And this kid wrote back his mother, "Send them over, send them over." I talked to a woman who was a young Iowa girl, a young wife, whose husband was killed in a night assault, a soldier, and she, at his funeral, asked the Army not to fire the salute at graveside. They said, "My husband has had enough gunfire around him. We don't need any more here in the cemetery." I talked to a swiftboat veteran who talked about one time when they were going up one of the canals and were ambushed by a group up in the trees, and they hit them with some pretty heavy ordnance from the swiftboat, and there was obviously some ammunition there, and there was a huge explosion. And he saw 2 or 3 bodies of what were Viet Cong soldiers fly up in the air and down. And they did whatever the 1960s equivalent of a high five was, and they celebrated. They had gotten them. And he said for the next few years, whenever he'd get talking about his experience, he would talk about how we got those bastards and about their bodies flying up in the air. About 10 years after this incident, he and his wife were in the Shenandoah Valley on a church retreat. And they were supposed to all walk individually through a maze and reflect on some things. And he said, "I got thinking about this." And I said, "These were 2 human beings. They probably had families someplace as well. Maybe in war we had to kill them, but we don't need to celebrate killing others of God's children." And he said he ran up in the woods away from the maze and just sat and wept and wept and wept, thinking about this. And he said, obviously, never again did I celebrate killing anyone. This is the face of war. These are the stories that need to be told. And these are the stories that often have no end. When I climbed up on Hamburger Hill, I brought with me something in my pocket that I'd taken over to Vietnam with me. After I got out of the Marines and decided I would go to school, I worked in the local mines. I was a powderman in a zinc mine. When they asked me if I wanted to be a powderman, I said, "I've never handled dynamite in my life." And they said, "Well, you're a Marine, you can do it." And I said, "I don't know anything about it." They said, "I'll give you 20 cents more an hour." And I said, $2.35 an hour? And he said, "Yep." I said, "You've got yourself a powderman." So I worked in the mines as a powderman. And my boss there was a World War II veteran, Purple Heart World War II veteran, a wonderful man. And I got to know his son, a young kid. And he was drafted, went into the Army, was with the 187th of the 101st, and went into Hamburger Hill on the 10th. He was a young sergeant. And on the 15th, he was hit in the chest with a rocket-propelled grenade and was killed. And I remember how shaken I was by this. We grew up in the town of Galena, Illinois. Galena is the Latin word for lead sulfide. And when I was working in the mine, I picked up a couple pieces of lead sulfide, this cube-shaped pieces of lead, and had them on my desk for years. I took one of them to Vietnam with me. And I told the North Vietnamese soldiers who had come up with me about this young man and what a wonderful kid he was. And I said, pulled this out and said, "This is a piece of our hometown. He may never have made it to the top of this hill, but now there will be a piece of his hometown here as long as this hill lasts. And I can assure you lead will last as long as the red clay lasts on Dong Ap Pia." I spoke on Veterans Day 2009 at the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. It was a very moving experience for me, standing in front of the wall on a cool rainy day with Gold Star mothers sitting in front of me and surrounded by veterans who had come to remember and to salute again. I concluded my remarks that day with this reminder, one that I guess continues to frame my own engagement and my own objective. I said that Veterans Day, casualties of war cry out to be known as persons, not as abstractions called casualties, nor as numbers entered into the books, and not only as names that are chiseled into marble or granite. We need to ensure that here, in this place of memory, lives as well as names are recorded. Lives with smiling human faces, remarkable accomplishments, engaging personalities, and with dreams to pursue. We do this for them, for history, and for those of the future who would send the young to war. And I guess, in many ways, trying to remember and remind about these lives has been an important part of what I've been doing for the last several years. In the play, Hamilton, George Washington, the old soldier, sings along with Eliza Hamilton, "Let me tell you what I wish I'd known when I was young and dreamed of glory. You have no control. Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story?" I guess my book represents my effort to contribute to the effort, to the obligation to make certain that the stories are told. And perhaps in the future, more can answer positively when someone says to them, "Did you know my brother?" My regards to all of the veterans who are here. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. All of us, the veterans and the non-veterans, need to join to tell the stories, and even more importantly, to listen to the stories, and finally, to learn from these stories. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
What is the main thing your interviewees wanted to know when you interviewed them?
I think many of the people that I interviewed told me that they had never before talked about their experience in Vietnam. And the fact that I was trying to tell the story, particularly the story of some friend of theirs who had died, they want that story to be told. I explained to all of them what I was trying to do to describe the human face of the Vietnam War, and they wanted to contribute to that, to help me to do it.
How did the writing your book change you?
That's an interesting question. It certainly has had a powerful impact on me. I think I've certainly feel closer to many of these people, even though most of them I've never met. I feel close to them. They're just wonderful people. They've been supportive of what I've been trying to write and what I've been trying to do here. And I have a fuller sense of the complexity of Vietnam and even greater admiration for those who served there. I believe that those who stand up when their country calls in a war that's unpopular, they still stand up, are to be commended even more. Most people that I interviewed, I don't know the experience of those of you in this room, but most people that I interviewed agreed that maybe shortly after they got there, they thought, this is not about dominoes falling. This is not about stopping somebody from attacking Los Angeles next week unless we stop them here. They realized that so many Vietnamese were hostile toward them, didn't want them there, were afraid of them. They realized that they were carrying so much of the fight that Arvin was held back and was not involved in it. And what they did, and veterans here know that, and I think veterans of any war, any time would know that. They weren't fighting for something that President Johnson or President Nixon was talking about. They were fighting for themselves, to look out for themselves. They learned to do that. And so importantly, they were looking out for their buddies. There's something I talk in the book about a buddy. And a buddy in a combat situation is not like a lifelong friend. Some of these guys, a few of them wept when they said, I went to look at my buddy's name on the wall, and I couldn't remember his name. All I knew was his nickname. That's all we called him. But there was a closeness that transcended what we normally think of as friendship. And anybody who's been in combat knows that how close you are to your buddies and what you think of them.
Why 1969? You focused really on May 1969. What is about that time frame?
In '69, President Nixon, remember the election of 1968, with the exception of George Wallace, who ran as a third-party candidate, nobody was talking about escalating our involvement in Vietnam. Hubert Humphrey had finally broken loose from Johnson, said he wanted to negotiate, and President Richard Nixon said that he had a secret plan to help to end the war. And it's clear that by then Gallup and other polls would indicate that people had lost their enthusiasm for the war in Vietnam. In May of 1969, mid-May, May 14th, I think it was, Richard Nixon gave a speech in which he said, we're not looking for a military victory here. Now, in truth, Lyndon Johnson was never looking really for a military victory. Vietnam was not a place where you swept an army in from the beach at Normandy and tried to liberate Paris 2 months later. It was not coming into the beach on Iwo Jima and raising a flag on top of Mount Suribachi. There were no flags raised there. It was a different sort of war. It wasn't about territory and geography. It was about trying to meet some political ends, and I think that there was increasing frustration. And after Hamburger Hill, word came down from the Pentagon, no more extended battles like this. There was a drawing back in the rules of engagement. Everyone became a bit more cautious. Now the war would go on for for 4 more years. There'd be American troops there, and many were killed in that period of time. But the nature of engagement changed. I believe that those of you, perhaps who were over there then, have done a disservice. This was a tough time to be in Vietnam. Any time was a tough time. But this was not an army of psychopaths taking marijuana and fragging their officers and engaging in mutiny. There were all of these instances, but not out. The guys that I talked to out in combat, they took it pretty seriously. They sure didn't want anybody smoking dope when they were out in the woods. They wanted everyone to be alert and ready. It was a different time, but they increasingly were frustrated. The old Korean War slogan of the soldiers who were over there at the end, who wants to die for a tie? There's a recognition this war is not going to be resolved militarily. Let's go home. But Nixon was engaged in a lot of cat and mouse with the Soviets and the Chinese and did not want to simply withdraw the troops right away.
Here's one that's rather interesting. I was in country in Vietnam 1968 to 1970. At the height of our involvement to the beginning of our withdrawal. I still remember my comrades who were KIA, their faces and their voices. I can never purge their memories. It's been 50 years. When my children or grandchildren ask me why, what do I say? What do I say?
Well, that's a hard question. What do you say? You say that your country called on you, and you stood up and you went. And if the war itself came to not the conclusion that we thought it was going to come to, when your country called, you stood up and went. And I think that there has to be room in this republic to still commend that. John Kennedy said, and so many people talked about Kennedy in his inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. This was something that generation took quite seriously. I'm not sure anybody today, any president or any major spokesman would really suggest that we should suddenly become unselfish and decide what we can do for our country. We've lost a lot of that. We've lost a lot of success, but this generation grew up with that in mind, and I think that has to be a source of pride.
Yeah. Thank you. A lot of my friends lost a decade somewhere along the way after they came back from Vietnam. Why did this happen so much?
Yeah, I think that there was embarrassment about Vietnam. I think that the Cali incident in late 1969, when it was reported, sort of cast a spell over it. I think some of the movies of the 1970s, that there was this image. And people talked about their experiences where they mentioned they were Vietnam veterans, somebody would be frightened of them. They didn't know what they were trying to do. I don't think there was ever as much, if you look at public opinion polls and other things, I don't think there was ever as much hostility toward the veterans as part of the folklore would have us, but there really was, I think, an unease around the veterans. I think that President Carter helped, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial helped, Max Cleland as head of VA helped, Ronald Reagan helped. Ronald Reagan spoke of Vietnam as being a noble cause. He backed away from that language, but he continued to talk about the heroes who had served there. And I think all of this had a tremendous impact. But it's taken a while, and even today, as somebody said, somebody says to you, "Thank you for your service." One of the Vietnam veterans I interviewed, he said, I look upon it sort of in the category of somebody saying "bless you" when you sneeze. It's just sort of an instinctive, polite thing to say. It really doesn't mean that we may thank them for serving. We may thank you for serving, but it's sort of the act of serving. Most people still don't want to know what you guys did over there, Mike.
Right. What was the toughest part of this book to write?
I think the part about coming home, about the wounded coming home, and about the death, the knocks on the door. There are parts of that chapter that, when I look through it still makes me teary. There are parts of the interview, when I read them again, I still get teary. These were some very powerful things. Susan would often ask me at the end of the day, "So how did your day go?" And it's not easy I could say okay, but I didn't say too much more than that. I didn't want to replay over the dinner table some of the things that I was even then trying to forget for an evening. There's some very powerful things, but I just, despite the power, despite the emotion, I came more and more to have a tremendous affection and admiration for those who were serving there, and I hope that that's reflected in this book.
I said in the introduction that part of it, reading this book, made me angry. One part, the interviews got to me when they told where you were about a veteran who had lost his arm and had a hook, meeting someone on a college campus who asked him, "Got that in Vietnam?" The veteran said yes. And the person said, "Serves you right," and walked away. That's kind of the emotions that come up.
Well, the veterans, interestingly, were not treated that. The World War II veterans then were controlling the VA and other organizations, and they didn't take to the Vietnam veterans. Some of them said, "We won our war, you guys didn't." But it really came down to the veterans' benefits and who was going to have them. And they talked about what we have come to understand as PTSD. They called it the post-Vietnam syndrome, as if this is something that affects the Vietnam experience only. And we know now that everybody whenever they fought in war, go back and read Ulysses again if you want validation of this. There's the same sort of thing. Look at Soldier's Heart, as it was called after the Civil War. But there was a dismissal of that. People said, "Oh, get out of here. We don't want to hear this stuff." One guy said to me he was laughed at when he talked to somebody in the VA about his nightmares and dreams. And he stormed out of the VA and didn't go back for 30 years. And by then the VA had changed, and they were obviously far more sympathetic and understanding of what he had done. But there was this tension going on.
Yeah. Did you interview any POWs after their return?
I didn't, no. As I said, because I was focusing on the combat units, it was a different thing. I do talk about the POWs here, but only in passing. I mean, that's another powerful book and story. I'm surely not dismissive of it, but I'm interested in the grunts who were on the ground.
Well, I have probably the last question here. Has anyone documented the experience of Dartmouth College classmates, mostly men, during the Vietnam War? Their on-campuses experiences?
Yeah, I interviewed actually some Dartmouth graduates for this book and talked to them about that. I've done some work on Dartmouth and the Vietnam War, and most of them did not have hostile experiences on campus. Again, by the late 60s, I think there's more and more of a change there. But the protesting there and at many places was focused more on the war than on those who served there. There's a subtle shift after My Lai, not so subtle perhaps, but remember in 66, 67, the chants, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Well, guess what, by 1970, LBJ's back on the ranch, and then they start calling the kids who served there baby killers. There weren't that many who used that. This was not the standard rhetoric of protest, but it was there enough. People had hostile experiences coming home. I think that the spitting and other more violent experiences have been exaggerated. Part of that was an effort, I think, to be dismissive of the anti-war movement, say they can't even respect veterans, but there's no doubt that indifference was there. I remember talking to an Army nurse, and people, as you know, who were in the medical corps really had nightmare after nightmare in Vietnam. And she was talking about this, and she came home, and her local parish had a potluck supper for her, and they welcome home from Vietnam, from serving. And she realized after the fact that nobody said a word about Vietnam or asked her anything about Vietnam. Another kid talked about a big family gathering, and he said, they all welcomed me home, but you'd think I'd been to Florida, except I had a deeper tan than I might have got in Florida, but nobody said a single word about Vietnam. I think it was, this bothered people. It's not that the veterans were anxious to talk about it, particularly those who had had difficult combat experiences. As you know, it's not something people easily and comfortably talk about. But there was this sort of sense that nobody really seems to care who we were and what we have done. And sort of the Vietnam generation closed down as well. Now that generation has done remarkably well. They've done a remarkable service for their country in the 45 years to 50 years since they served in Vietnam. But it's time to talk out a little bit about this and about the experience. And it's time to extend a handshake. I don't know that there's this is sort of my handshake, I guess.
Well, thank you for this handshake. Dr. Wright, thank you so much. Beautiful program.